SharePoint apps are the newest option in SharePoint 2013 extension. Let's take a quick look at the guidance around using it, deployment options and methods, and concepts that you need to be thinking about when you look at on-premises, cloud, or Office 365 deployments. SharePoint apps are a new way of working with SharePoint extensions. They're for use when you want to be technology independent. I mentioned this, you'll see in the examples here that we're going to be using JavaScript, but there is no reason why you can't do SharePoint apps in Java or Ruby or anything else that you want to that can output HTML to be used inside of SharePoint. Just be aware of that this is one of those places where all of your options open up with using SharePoint extensions. If you have applications you want to modify a bit to become a SharePoint app, now you've got the capability of inserting that information directly into SharePoint. There's been some old efforts to take SharePoint web parts and tie them in with various standards for portal extensions. Basically, SharePoint apps is where all of this kind of history comes together. The other side of this is it removes the need to run code on SharePoint, on the SharePoint farm itself. The code that you actually register as a SharePoint app has the capability to run in other areas. The idea for SharePoint apps is actually to remove the executable code off of the SharePoint deployment. And this is there to make sure that your SharePoint deployment is as close to tested configuration as possible while giving your apps as much resources as possible. So instead of putting things in, such as we did with solutions, with sandbox solutions, of doing arbitrary units of CPU cycles, of response times, of all of those kind of pieces, with SharePoint apps, you remove all of that processing off of the SharePoint deployment and put it on some other location, which means that if you do have a problem or if you do have downtime with that other solution, your SharePoint deployment continues operating. You'll get a notification that this app is not functioning correctly, but the rest of the SharePoint infrastructure just rolls merrily along. That helps you with uptime, that helps you with stability, that helps you with maintainability with your SharePoint deployment. If you're doing SharePoint apps, this also means that you're opened up to doing things such as providing the app in the Office store. You can actually put it up so people can use it on their Office 365 environment. As Office 365 continues to expand out into different organizations, having a custom app that can actually tie in with a cloud-based SharePoint becomes more and more valuable. This also means that those apps can be put into the store. You can actually run it and offer it for sale to organizations outside of your group. So if you are an ISV, or if you have a capability that you think would be work well in the market, SharePoint apps is a very nice way of offering that capability out into the marketplace, being able to do proper licensing and to be able to handle that functionality outside of your organization. And I mentioned licensing. The SharePoint apps have a fairly complex, comprehensive ability to do licensing. So it's easy to set up, but you can actually do some very interesting different capabilities, both for site licenses, for implementation licenses, for user licenses, for combination of those. Basically, all of the options that you've seen in the Windows Store or the Windows Phone Store come into the Office Store and are able to work with your SharePoint app, in addition to some of the pieces that may not be as familiar to the kind of consumer-focused Windows and Windows Phone stores. The flip side of that, or the trade-off that you have, is the SharePoint apps have less access to SharePoint capabilities. You're basically working through the client object model, or you're working through the web services. So you're traditionally, if you've been working with SharePoint solutions or web parts actually running on the SharePoint site, you've been able to get access to the full server object model, which is very rich and very deep. Know that you do lose some of that capability. You are actually stepping outside of that trust boundary when you're creating SharePoint apps, which means that you're going to be working with a little bit less access. You're going to be working with some of the capabilities that maybe some of the things that you want to do take a couple of steps rather than just a single call to a list object or an item object. Take that into account. Know that you're going to have some more latencies because your calls are going to be outside of that trust boundary as well. The trade-off is there because now there's no telling where your code may be running. Could be running half a world away from the SharePoint implementation. So all of that has to be serialized and moved around and basically handled and security checked. So be aware that it does mean that you'll need to do a little bit of caching on your side to keep that performance up, or be able to gather in or grab larger blocks of data so you can actually work with it more on the client side. It's a reasonable trade-off, but know that it's there. For deployment, you can actually configure your SharePoint deployment to auto-host SharePoint apps, which means you can actually use that same farm as you would before with a SharePoint solution or SharePoint workflow would actually be inside your farm. This is not the optimal end goal for Guidance, but know that if you've kind of set up for things, or if you just want to try it out, or if you're comfortable with how your resources are, you absolutely can use your same SharePoint farm to put SharePoint apps in that you would use it for all of your other pieces. When you're on the SharePoint server, the key factor to look at is making sure that you have no server-side code. When we do our example, you'll be seeing how we can actually do this with just JavaScript and have the JavaScript call back into the client object model, the JavaScript object model, and be able to pull back that information. All of that code is actually running in the browser. It's using the browser as a client itself. So that makes it a lot easier on the SharePoint resources, because now all of the UI and all of the different formatting and functionality is happening on the client side. And SharePoint is just making sure that the correct data gets passed over there, so know how that works. You can actually host it with Office 365. You can use Azure for the hosting area, and Azure SQL to have that on the back end. So being able to put it as full cloud becomes a lot easier. There are tools actually built in to help you actually tie the Azure and the Azure SQL in so that you can literally not have to run a server at all, but have full access, have full control, and then can be hosted with any technology. Again, I mentioned with the Guidance, if you want to do this in Ruby, if you want to do it in Python, if you want to do it in Java, SharePoint doesn't really care. SharePoint is just working with the calls through the standards-based object model, through the web services and through all of the interfaces there, through standard HTTP requests. And then it's actually pulling back to the HTML to put inside of the display. So you're looking at things that are very distant, that don't have a lot of interaction with the SharePoint app model internally or inside that trust boundary. So whatever you want to do, if you've got developers that are used to or more comfortable with other technologies than, say, a .NET, there's no reason not to allow them to gain access to your SharePoint implementation, work with it through the client object model, and to create SharePoint apps in whatever environment they choose to. So really, really opening up on that and being able to put those out into different areas. And on the concern with on-prem, cloud, and Office 365, all the configurations are going through that client API. And the client API is the client object model, the JavaScript object model, and the web services that I mentioned. SharePoint apps don't allow you to put any code onto the SharePoint instance. I mentioned that if you're on-prem, you can have SharePoint do the hosting, but that is actually in a completely different process. There's no ability to actually get anything to run in that server context. So be aware of that. That means that, again, you may have some objects that you don't have access to. You may have to do multiple calls differently than you would on the server side, but you're in good shape on that. This is an interesting one, no changing of SharePoint definition. So there's some things that the app model doesn't allow you to change, things such as some of the templates, some of the different capabilities there. Those do need to be handled actually on the server. This is mainly for some of the templatizing that happens in Office 365, but it's also a bit of security modeling as well, to be able to make sure that you don't have somebody come in with off of something random, and to be able to do some functionality that you really don't want to have happen through there. And saying that, you also need to be aware that SharePoint apps cannot perform any administrative level tasks. Again, you don't want something coming outside. Having those interfaces, having those types of functionality available through a SharePoint app also means that it would be available for random calls or things outside of the SharePoint model. And that would be a additional attack surface for SharePoint that's just really not acceptable. So know that if you have some administrative tasks that need to be done for the SharePoint app setup, or if you want to do something with the SharePoint administration, not really something that fits in with the SharePoint app model. You may have something that runs on the server, or you have something that happens, maybe a workflow or even a SharePoint solution in the administrative area that sets those pieces up, or may do some additional capabilities. Maybe your SharePoint app inserts some data into a task list, and then something that's actually on the server, a component there, can actually do some of the administrative pieces, pick up those instructions and work with it. But at that point, you're actually looking at signed code, you're looking at the GUIDs, you're looking at a lot more accountability. So it makes things work a lot better. So just know that these are some restrictions when you're looking at that. Whether you're looking at on-premises, where you can actually put the app hosting onto your SharePoint instance, you're still not working with the SharePoint server model. If you're looking at cloud, where you've got a full SharePoint implementation there, you're looking at basically how those definitions and administrative tasks come into play. And if you're doing Office 365, just remember that you need to find something outside of Office 365 to pull in your apps and handling those kind of pieces. So same SharePoint running in all those different places, but slightly different configurations and slightly different concerns to be able to look at with the SharePoint app model.